I'm going to cover 3 topics today. What does the P in 24 and 1080p mean? Is there a difference between 23.97 frames a second and 24 frames a second? And what frame rate should I use to get the best results? So what does the P in 24p mean? Well, the P stands for progressive. Video is either progressive or interlaced. Interlaced is designed or is purposed for delivering content to broadcast television. Pretty much every DSLR, SLR, or mirrorless camera out there is not going to provide video in interlaced format. They're all going to be progressive. So what's the difference between 29.97 frames per second and 30 frames per second, or 30p? If you look at the camera's website under specifications, what you'll see is 29.97 frames per second, or 23.97 frames a second, 119.88 frames a second. If you look at the marketing material, you'll see 24p, 30p, 120p. It's the same information, but it's viewed differently. Camera companies need to be compliant with the markets that they sell into. For Europe, that's the PAL standard. PAL doesn't have this awkward 0.97 or 0.88 frames. NTSC first came out with a color standard in 1953, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail of what that really means, but suffice it to say, Europe had a bit more time to think about this, so consequently, if you are in Europe or other areas in the world that use PAL, you have 24 frames a second, 30, 50, none of this fractional stuff. So what frame rate should you use for your video? Well, that depends. 24 frames per second should be used if you want to create that Hollywood look. It produces 24 full frames per second, but it creates that motion blur that a lot of people like. That motion blur that you get in movies. When things move fast, you get a bit of a blur. However, the quality of that blur and that effect will vary largely on how much you spend on a camera. Also, setting your camera to 24 frames a second isn't by itself going to give you a cinematic look. That cinematic look is created through many different attributes. What I'm talking about is, well, for example, color grading. Color grading. Color grading, how you frame the scenes. And there's a whole list. I'm not going to get into it now. As you can tell, I can't even get the words out right now. But suffice it to say, it's more than just 24 frames per second, but you do definitely get that motion blur. But that cinematic look can be achieved with other frame rates. Many movies have been shot in 48 frames a second. And recently, I forgot the name of the movie, but there's a movie that was just released and it's in 120 frames a second. 30 frames a second is commonly used for home movies or digital video. Use 30 frames a second if you want to capture the world the way it is. It captures movement in a natural way. You don't get nearly as much motion blur for most subjects like children running around or cars, that kind of thing. 24 frames per second is best for fast action. It creates slow motion for 24 frames per second projects. So you get a slow motion factor of 2. It's good for boating, running, or pretty well any fast action sports. It's also really good if you're on some sort of vehicle that's moving, that's very agitated, it's bouncing around, and that slow-mo will help slow things down and give you a buttery smooth look. 48p has been used in Avatar, The Hobbit, and Momentum. 60 frames per second provides the same slow motion capabilities in the same scenarios as 48p. It's just designed for projects that have a 30 frame per second progressive. If you start to shoot in 120 or 240 frames per second, these just give you a higher magnitude of slow motion. In my recommendation, having a camera that shoots 120 frames per second with autofocus provides you the best slow motion effect. It's buttery smooth. This is good for even just your standard moments, like if your child's kind of running at you or is playing. Capturing that at 120 frames per second looks terrific. Weddings as well. Weddings you can slow it down to 60, but 120 gives you that buttery smooth look. So P does stand for progressive, but it also stands for pixels. 720p and 1080p, that actually refers to the number of horizontal lines of information. 1080p refers to a frame size of 1920 by 1080, so that's 1080 lines across versus 1920 lines vertically. 720p is 1280 by 720. 1080p is commonly referred to as Full HD, and 720p is referred to as HD. 4K is very special because it contains 4 times the amount of information that is in 1080p. Or, to look at it another way, you can actually fit 4 full HD frames inside a 4K frame. And where that really helps you out is if your final project is in 1080p, you now have the ability to punch in or zoom or pan. So an example is, my son's playing in the backyard and I want to capture him, for example. I'll record wide open at about 18 millimeters on a crop sensor, and I'll just record it. I'll let it record for a couple of minutes, however much time I need. Then when I get into the computer, my project's going to be 1080p. It's either going to be 24 or 30 frames per second, progressive. And now I have the opportunity, I can start off with my scene, and what it's going to do is going to take that 4K information and convert it down to 1080p. And it's going to have a lot of detail. A few seconds later, I want to zoom in and get a bit of a close-up. So I can zoom in by a factor of 2 and not lose any detailed information. I can also pan from right to left, left to right, or up or down. I can pan anywhere within that 4K frame space. And I'm not going to suffer from rolling shutter or any other effects because that information is there in that 4K frame. I can zoom within that space because I've got 4 full HD frames I can pull in. So it gives you a lot of benefits there. 4K is essentially equivalent to one 8 megapixel photo. And 1080p is equivalent to 2 megapixels. Again, a factor of 4. What's the best way to shoot? 24, 30, 60, 120? Well, take your camera, go outside and play around with it. Shoot in 24 and shoot in 30 and spend a good bit of time playing around with where you've got fast action, where you've got things that aren't moving around so much, and try them out. For slow motion, I think 100 or 120 frames per second is where you get that really buttery smooth, but it's not too slow. Once you start getting past 120 frames per second, you can start to suffer from lack of detail. Most consumer grade or prosumer grade cameras, if they're giving you more than 120 frames per second, you're losing something. You're losing detail, you're losing autofocus or something because it can't output any more information to the card. It's limited in what it can output. So to be able to output more frames per second, it's got to sacrifice something. And also, you could have 1080p that refers to 1080 progressive frames per second, and you can also have 1080p referring to the horizontal lines. What's the difference? It's the context and how it's mentioned. So that's it for tonight. I just want to go through a couple of things. I see a lot of videos talking about 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second. What should you use? Where people will line up the video and show it to you. I want you guys to be able to experience that yourself. So that's it for this video. Thank you very much for zooming in. If you like the video, please click like down below. If not, you may click dislike. Click it twice, in fact. And please subscribe. I'm going to be producing at least one video each week. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you soon.